Woot. Do the going live dance.
All right. It says the red button says we're live officially.
Yes.
Welcome to
We've reached that stage of this show where let's just add a dancing routine into this.
Why not?
Do I need to go get the banjo? By the time we're done with this, I might actually be able to play a real song. That would be wonderful. But
nice, perfect. We'll give it a minute to go on the Loudon Museum page and the Mosby page.
Yeah.
There we go.
Woot.
Yeah, the more I was doing research on the story, the more I was like, this is really interesting and also extremely confusing for me too. It was expanding months, more and more people getting involved. I was like, oh boy. The rabbit hole continues. So I'll give it one more second.
How's everybody's week been so far? Everybody doing all right?
Us?
Anne-Marie?
Yeah. Short week?
Yeah.
I mean, I was just commiserating with Andrea that it does not feel like a holiday week. Like, I feel like I've been working at least 6 days already.
Yeah, I kind of forgot it was a holiday since I didn't make plans or anything. I couldn't go anywhere. Awesome. Well, I think we're good to go on the museum page, and I think on the Mosby Heritage Area page as well. So good evening, everyone. I'm Joe Rizzo with the Loudon Museum. And like always, I'm joined with Anne-Marie Paquette and Travis Shaw of the Mosby Heritage Area Association. And this is the next edition of History on Tap. And this week's episode is 1863's A Crowd. And we're going to look at some of the obscure and interesting stories locally from the extremely important year of 1863. Our guest this week is Dr. Lauren Thompson, who's an assistant professor of history at McKendree University. So she's tuned in from St. Louis. And while you're watching at home, let us know in the comments section what you're drinking, what questions you have. It's obviously an important year, politically, militarily, socially, during the Civil War. So we want to know what you're thinking, what you're wondering, and we'll add those in. We've got Andrea behind the scenes to feed us those questions throughout the episode. So like always, let's go around the room and see what everyone's drinking and what everyone's going to talk about. So Travis, how about you?
So tonight I am drinking a local brew. It is Rhino Chasers from Lost Rhino Brewing here in Loudoun County. It's a hopped Pilsner, so kind of light, refreshing, perfect for a day like today. And I will be talking about one of the more colorful characters to come through this area in 1863, gentleman who wins the Medal of Honor at the Battle of Aldie in June of 1863, and kind of where his career goes from there.
Awesome. Anne-Marie, how about you? What are you drinking?
So I spent most of my day today online chatting with a great school of 6th graders, sharing some Civil War history with them, but I admit I'm completely pooped, so I broke into some red wine tonight. This is Equation by Bro Vineyards here in Loudoun County, and Joe tells me it is the largest vineyard in the county. So there's the fun fact for you.
It is, and they, I think, are opening up tomorrow like a lot of the breweries are. I think the new tomorrow are partially open back up. Lauren, how about you?
That's what I was talking about.
All right, Anne-Marie's out.
It's not my topic. So I will not be talking about wine tonight. Or will I? No, tonight I was going to talk a little bit about the impact of the Emancipation Proclamation on a couple of local families here in Northern Virginia and kind of the different perspectives seen in the area. Okay, Lauren, go for it.
Awesome.
I thought your topic
Thanks for
was
having me. Thanks for having me, y'all. Usually I would prefer a wine, but I had to represent St. Louis because we have so many awesome breweries. And I selected a cider from Brick River Cider Company in downtown St. Louis. So that's what I'll be having when I talk to y'all tonight. Because I'm drinking alcohol from St. Louis, I'm going to first tell a quick little story about an Illinois soldier who got into some trouble while drinking in St. Louis and faced a court-martial in result. And then after that, I'm actually going to switch gears to a completely different soldier, a completely different experience, and how he goes from being captured to doing the capturing, and how he also will win a Medal of Honor for his heroic effort at Pickett's Charge on July 3rd, 1863. So can't wait to tell y'all.
And I am drinking Bide My Time Lager from Dirk Farm Brewing out in Bluemont, Virginia. And I'm going to talk about political prisoners that were from Loudoun County. They were taken prisoner by both the Confederate and Union forces. So I'll get into a bit about civilian imprisonment during the war. Well, awesome. So again, if you're watching at home, it's about 1863. We're looking at big issues, from Pickett's Charge to Emancipation, Gettysburg. Big issues of the war, but we're telling some local obscure stories. But any questions you have about any of those, just let us know. So Travis, you want to get started and talk about that soldier?
Sure, absolutely. I think my story probably would be classified as one of those more local or obscure stories. And it's the story of one of the most colorful characters, I think, to come through the area in 1863, which is a pretty tough competition. I mean, a lot of colorful characters come through Loudoun County, Northern Virginia, the Piedmont during the Civil War. But the guy I'm talking about tonight is, he's an Italian immigrant. His name is Luigi di Cesnola. And really fascinating guy. I love talking about this guy because he really is, he's good at self-aggrandizement. A lot of the stories that surround him, you're not quite sure where fact begins and fiction ends. But we do know he's born near Turin, Italy in 1832. Born into an aristocratic family, military family. He had ancestors who had served alongside Napoleon's armies and so forth. So carrying on that tradition, at the age of 15, he joins the army of what is then the Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont. And this is the first war of Italian unification. So Sardinia-Piedmont is fighting against Austria to try and unify Italy. So 15 years old, Luigi signs up. A year later, he's actually given a brevet promotion to second lieutenant for his bravery at the Battle of Novara. Now, unfortunately for the Piedmontese, Novara is an absolutely crushing defeat. It really ends any hope of unifying Italy at that time. But Luigi does well enough. He's recognized as kind of a natural leader. He gets an appointment to the Royal Military Academy. And from there, he actually also goes on to serve during the Crimean War as a staff officer. Now, this is where, again, there's a lot of legend, like hearsay, we don't really know. At some point, for some unknown reason, he leaves the Piedmontese army, and he actually ends up in New York City in 1858. And he arrives in New York basically with nothing. He tries a few different things. He's like teaching Italian, teaching French, he's writing music and things like that. Not particularly successful until he marries the daughter of a wealthy naval officer. He marries Mary Read, whose father had been a hero of the War of 1812. And then kind of using her money, he sets up a military academy in New York City. Now, you're right, I guess so. Well, February 1861 is probably a good time to set up a military academy because there's a lot going on. And over the next 6 months, he and I use this word kind of loosely, trains hundreds of potential officers, many of whom will go on to serve in the United States Army during the coming Civil War. So really kind of, he's already established himself as this European military authority at a time when the US government is looking around for anyone that has military experience. So he actually gets a commission very early on in an infantry regiment. But then within a short amount of time, he becomes the colonel of the 4th New York Cavalry. And it's with the 4th New York that he's really going to make a name for himself. He's going to serve, throughout 1862. He's involved in a lot of heavy fighting. 1863, he actually ends up in temporary command of a cavalry brigade at the Battle of Brandy Station. And it's really kind of around this time that his trouble begins. First of all, the first strike against him, Cesnola is a McClellan supporter, which is not a good thing to be in the Army of the Potomac after 1862. You know, a lot of officers who had kind of tied themselves to McClellan are not popular at this point in time. You know, it's politically kind of sticky issue. He also doesn't really get along well with his superior officers. Now, whether this comes from kind of his aristocratic upbringing or just his kind of fiery personality, I don't know. Whatever the case, he gets very upset when he is, after temporarily commanding this brigade, asked to go back to the 4th New York. Someone else gets promoted to the position. He really feels like it's his due. He's going to argue with a lot of his superiors. So in June of 1863, as the 4th New York and the rest of the cavalry of the Army of the Potomac are marching into Loudoun County, he's actually under arrest. He is arrested for insubordination. He's stripped of his sword and his other weapons. And he's held in confinement. And this is where he's going to be on the morning of June 17th, 1863. Now, just to give a little bit of military setup, you know, here we are mid-June, Robert E. Lee's army. Uh-oh, what are you doing at? Emery's laughing at me. Robert E. Lee's army is moving north up the Shenandoah Valley towards Pennsylvania. And the Union Army is east of the Blue Ridge, desperately trying to find out where Lee is and where he's headed. And to try and do this, they are going to push troops westward up the Ashby's Gap Turnpike, through Aldie, through Middleburg, through Upperville, to try and get over the Blue Ridge and find out where Lee is. And the 4th New York Cavalry is a big part of this movement. And it's going to end up in like a week of battles in Aldie, Middleburg, and Upperville, trying to force their way over the Blue Ridge. So June 17th is the first day of that battle. Fighting is going to erupt outside the village of Aldie. The 4th New York Cavalry is going to be thrown into the fight. They're going to charge a Confederate position, and they're going to come tumbling back in complete disarray. Luigi sees this happening. He basically hops on his horse, leaves his arrest. You know, he rides out into the field without any weapons, without a sword, without pistols or anything, rallies his men and leads them into another charge on the Confederate position, completely unarmed. Now, again, this is a man who there's a lot of legends surrounding the actions of Luigi di Cesnola. Supposedly, General Judson Kilpatrick sees this, and Kilpatrick is one of Luigi's superiors who was confining him in arrest just a few hours before, sees this happen, and according to a few accounts, gives him this stirring speech, basically pulls his sword out, hands it to Luigi and says, "You did this without your sword, take my sword and don't bring it back till it's covered with the blood of the enemy." You know, I don't know if that's true. It's repeated in a lot of later histories of the Battle of Aldie. What's that?
I said, from what I know about Judson Kilpatrick, it's hard to know who's probably lying more in the story.
Yeah, again, larger than life personalities are all over the place there. But yes, supposedly he gets handed the sword and is like, you know, go get him, killer. And he will lead the 4th New York in 2 more charges against the Confederates. In the 4th and final charge, Luigi actually falls wounded. He takes a saber wound to the head, saber wound to the hand. He's shot in the arm. His horse is shot from under him, and he's actually pinned under his dead horse for hours, lying there on the battlefield, surrounded by dead and wounded. And later that evening, Confederate troops will actually find him there pinned under his horse and will take him prisoner. Now, the legend kind of grows from here because Luigi di Cesnola will actually receive the Medal of Honor for his performance at the Battle of Aldie. And a lot of future histories, 19th century and early 20th century histories, will refer to him as the hero of Aldie, which I love because, again, we don't know how much of this is kind of legend or not. But I will read his Medal of Honor citation. Says, quote, "Was present in arrest when seeing his regiment fall back, he rallied his men, accompanied them without arms in a second charge, and in recognition of his gallantry was released from arrest. He continued continued in the action at the head of his regiment until he was desperately wounded and taken prisoner. So the hero of Aldie will eventually get his Medal of Honor for this action. Now, Luigi spends the next 9 months at Libby Prison in Richmond. Kind of a weird, interesting story that's going on there. But, you know, he will eventually in the spring, he again, this kind of temperament leads to some interactions with Confederate authorities there that you know, very interesting. Eventually he will be exchanged. He fights out much of the rest of the war, the Petersburg campaign and stuff like that. But in 1865, he leaves the army for a diplomatic posting. And this is where, like, I think his story really starts to get interesting. He, first of all, starts referring to himself as general. Now, he was never officially promoted to general. According to him, it was one of those things that, like, Lincoln had it on his desk, like his brevet promotion, but just didn't get around to it because of the assassination. But, like, had Lincoln survived, his promotion.
Definitely.
Yeah, right. Definitely. He would have gotten to it.
This is next on his list. Not been assassinated.
And if you go to see his grave in New York today, it says General Luigi di Cesnola. But he gets a diplomatic posting to Cyprus in 1865, which is still part of the Ottoman Empire at the time, but he's there working as the U.S. consul, and he takes up an interest in antiquities. And he spends the next 12 years that he is in Cyprus excavating hundreds, probably thousands of archaeological sites across the island. Much to the chagrin of the Ottoman authorities, who really didn't give him any sort of authorization to do this. This is still an era when, like, archaeology is not what we know it is today. You know, nowadays, archaeologists take a lot of records on the context and everything to actually get historical information. Back then, it was basically collecting cool stuff so that you can show it off to your friends. And that's what he will do. He recovers 35,000 artifacts from the island of Cyprus. And to this day, like, a lot of people in Cyprus are still pretty upset about him looting their island. But of course, in the 1870s, he wasn't considered a looter. He was considered quite the scientist. He writes several books on the history of Cyprus. Cyprus, its ancient cities, tombs, and temples. Is released in 1877, and that puts his name on the map, so that when he returns to the United States in 1879, again, he's not considered a looter. He is considered, you know, kind of one of the most prominent figures in the field. So he will sell that collection to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And the Met is so thrilled with this collection that in 1879, Luigi di Cesnola, the hero of Aldi, is named the first director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And he will hold that post for the next 25 years until his death. 25 years. So if you go to the Met today, or, you know, whenever it opens back up and you're able to visit, you will see there are literally thousands of objects at the Met, tens of thousands of objects that are from the Di Cesnola collection. And it all comes from the private collection of this Italian soldier adventurer guy, Tomb Raider, who really has the Battle of Aldi to thank. You know, had he not broken his the Battle of Aldi and become this famous hero, like, he probably would have never ended up getting a diplomatic post. He would have never ended up serving in the government after the war. So it's kind of a weird roundabout story, and I particularly love that you know, this man's entire life changed just because of something he did in Aldi in June of 1863.
So I think the
I
key to the
guess
story
all
is
we
for
can do
grad
is
students
offer
to
those
just
to
dig
the
up
general.
artifacts and you got a job. To Luigi.
I apologize, guys. My internet connection says it's a little bit unstable, so I think my video
It's
might be
rough internet
hiccuping a little
connection
bit.
this week.
Yeah, I was
Yeah,
having
hopefully that's
it's a little
not
choppy for me
interrupting
too.
our viewers at home too much.
Travis, do you know what he was
All right. But anyways, I think
reprimanded for by Patrick?
Okay, so Joe just asked what he was reprimanded for. Okay, so I've read several different things. One account said something about him like selling stolen pistols north or something like that, and then someone else said selling property to the north that he had stolen. But most accounts say it was just insubordination. Like, first of all, he was angry about being passed up for promotion. And then some people say he deliberately rode his unit through an infantry camp that morning, like just to be a jerk. I don't know, like just to show his disdain for his everyone else. I wasn't able to find like definitively what it was. Now, Civil War cavalry expert Eric Wittenberg, who's like a good friend of MHA, in his writing on Chesnola, which I will take for granted because I know Eric does his research, he said he brings up the riding his regiment through the infantry camp story. So I'm gonna go with that. But basically, I think he was kind of the kind of guy that people were looking for an excuse to bust him. He does not seem to have been very popular with his superior officers.
I do appreciate that he started the day arrested, and then he fought in the battle, and then ended up arrested again. So like there's a comforting level of continuity there.
Yeah,
I thought this
under
was leading to him
radically
getting
different
arrested.
circumstances. I just love the like Judson Kilpatrick quote, whether it's real or not, like, "Don't bring my sword back till it's covered with the enemy's blood," kind of thing. Like, that's totally like an action movie trope, and I love it.
Yeah. I think it's actually from a Schwarzenegger, isn't it? So I guess I'll go ahead and jump in. Hopefully our connection remains stable. I wish there was a way I could just kind of refresh it without exiting it, everything, and bring it back in. But so something that we've talked about ever since our first edition of these Civil War kind of retrospectives, 1861, 1862, now here we are 1863, and each time we kind of revisit the growing idea of abolition on a national scale, the growing legislation leading to abolition on a national scale. And so 1863 is, of course, a landmark year because of the Emancipation Proclamation, which goes into effect on January 1st of 1863. Now, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation does not free all of the enslaved peoples living in the United States of America. It notably leaves out all of the enslaved peoples living in the border states, and it also accepts from that rule some of the cities that are occupied by federal troops as well. So it's by no means on the same scale as, say, the 13th Amendment in terms of guaranteeing freedoms, in terms of legalizing and permanently, instituting, the recognition of these rights. But nonetheless, it's a huge deal. And it also is going to send shockwaves across the South, regardless of whether individuals across the South think that the North can live up to this proclamation, live up to this promise. Things take on a different edge once the Emancipation Proclamation really goes into effect. So again, January 1st is the effective by date of the Emancipation Proclamation. And starting in January of 63, we see references to this in the diaries and in the letters of individuals who are living south of the Mason-Dixon. Especially here in Virginia's Piedmont area, freedom for enslaved peoples has been a source of tension for years already. The northern states are just a few miles away. If enslaved peoples, 10, 20 years ago were hoping to gain freedom, Pennsylvania is only like a one night's distance journey away if you could go directly. So Virginians are already used to this idea of the tension between freedom and enslavement being on their border, but now it's very different because wherever the Union troops go, freedom now effectively goes with them in a legal and enforceable way. The other thing about, of course, Northern Virginia Piedmont, and Travis touched on this a little bit with the battles of Aldie, Middleburg, and Upperville, the whole swath of Northern Virginia, and really you could say just anywhere between DC and Richmond, it's almost like a beach, and there's just a wave of Union forces that come up and then eventually are drawn back, and Confederate troops that come in and then are drawn back, just over and over again, washing over this area. And with it, each time there's a new raid that happens that steals all the hams out of your meat house, or they come and they take away all of your wheat, or they burn down your barn. It's like every couple of months there's a new sheriff in town, there's a new system of rules, and whatever you thought was going on has now changed. So suffice to say, the inhabitants of Northern Virginia during this time, especially the women who are home trying to run households or run farms, are going to bear a lot of the brunt of this as it goes back and forth. And so emancipation, you get an interesting view of it when you look through some of their diary entries. And there are many great diaries written from folks who live in this area during the Civil War. For this, I'm specifically referring to Catherine Hopkins Brown's diary, Dark Days in Our Beloved Country, and also My Heart is So Rebellious, which I think should also be like a romantic novel. So, but this is a diary by Susan Caldwell, who is living in Warrenton during the Civil War.
Both books available
Warrenton
from
is an interesting place in 1860. Yes, you can purchase both of these volumes. So Susan Caldwell is living in Warrenton, and she's in her late mid-30s, early 40s, kind of an age bracket during the Civil War. She has young children. Her husband is working in Richmond for much of the war. He signs up for the Richmond Home Guard for part of the war, and Susan is just endlessly fretting about her husband and her family and their health and everything else that's going on. And Warrenton is an interesting place in 1863 because, of course, it has been the site of winter encampments for Union forces that preceding winter. So they're effectively an occupied town. They're under Union control for all intents and purposes. And so that means that the Emancipation Proclamation can be enforced in some way in this town. And it's interesting that in the early part of the year, she doesn't make too many allusions to it. But then when it's time for the Union forces to leave, there is also this massive exodus of formerly enslaved people who are going to make their way out of town, supported by the federal government. And so she writes, let me see here. There's a great line, there it is, that she opens it up with, which is that, "Let us be joyful, the Yankees have taken French leave," which means that they're just running off. So it's never too early for a France joke. And that's how Susan Caldwell opens the letter to her husband. So the Yankees are taking their French leave. Along with it, they're taking hundreds of servants, which is her term for enslaved peoples. There are about 150 servants left town on the cars. So that's the rail line that's going to go to Alexandria. So they're just packing people in to these rail cars and literally shipping them out of town. The Union troops are leaving, and so they're going to take as many of these individuals as they can with them to send them to places like Alexandria and Washington, D.C., where there are aid societies and other organizations that will help put them to work, find them somewhere to live, maybe have them, help the Union Army in some way, coming up with a chain, a place for them to go outside of the South. And apparently, according to Susan, they were telling them that Jeff Davis intended arresting all free and slaves and making them either go into the army or work on the cotton fields. Woo. So they're saying that if you don't come with us, Jeff Davis is going to make you go down south. The Negroes were as bold as they could be. Those who were housekeeping had auctions and sold out all their goods. So the wealthier inhabitants of Warrenton who could stay somewhere else out in the country, who had other houses, would have left housekeepers in charge of their townhomes. And now that they're left, and now that their enslaved peoples can go free, they're just selling off all the goods, because why not? So she lists a number of individuals in town whose whole households are leaving them, 8, 9, 10, a dozen at a time, including the Warren Green Hotel, which had 8 enslaved people working there who all just, dropped and left, on the rail line. And also includes individuals like Ditcher, the whitewasher. So folks you would see about town who do regular, work, your basic service jobs, all kind of poofing out of town. So there's even an account that she writes about of this little old lady, an enslaved woman, this little old lady who brings $100 in hand, brings $100 to her former enslaver and says, here, money, here, my son is coming from Washington, D.C., and I'm leaving with him. And her enslaver, I don't know whether it's irritation or whether it's some kind of hubris or whether it's some kind of understanding of the situation. He says, just take it and leave, just get out, kind of a thing. So we have this really fascinating example of a society that's built around this labor, that's built around having these individuals here, and in some cases a willing ignorance that these individuals want to be here. And yet when they're presented with literally a one-way ticket on a rail car to freedom, and they're just jumping in. It should, of course, be noted that, of course, not every newly freed individual goes with the federal army. Not every individual decides at this point to leave or to go gain their freedom somewhere else. There are a number of individuals who decide to stay there in Warrenton or to stay in Fauquier. But this is a pivotal moment in the relationships between those households, that Mrs. Caldwell herself writes that, Aunt Lucy stayed here, but I don't know if I can trust any of these servants anymore. So it's kind of a moment of mental reckoning where whatever they thought their domestic life was like before is not the case, and they have to, in some cases, I believe, take a hard look at assumptions that they might have made about their households, over the past several generations. And similarly, so Katherine Brown, who had Susan Caldwell in Warrenton, Katherine Brown is living in Middleburg in Loudoun County, southern Loudoun County. And again, from a very well-off family. They own a number of enslaved peoples. Katherine Brown is in her early 40s during the Civil War. She again has young children. Her husband is one of what's the right word to use here? He's a very wealthy man. He's very prosperous. He's a successful merchant in Middleburg. They own a large storefront and a home in Middleburg, and they also own Sunnybank Farm, just a few miles outside of town. And so they'll spend usually summers at the country house and then winters in town. And Katherine's really interesting because she'll write about her servants in her daily life when she's talking to us about her kids and other things that are going on. And so it gives you a great peek, at least into this family and how they lived with their servants, what they thought about their servants, things like that. And Katherine tells us on a couple of points, just glancing by, every Sunday, they all gather together, servants included, and they read Bible passages aloud. So she includes the servants in that, and they gather around in the kitchen, they talk about prayers, and they read the Bible passages, and the servants are part of that. She writes about how on her each of their children's birthdays, she has that child gather up little treats and goodies and presents, and her children visit the servants who had nursed them when they were first born, and they give these servants gifts. And I don't know that this was a very common practice in the South, but it's an interesting idea that there's a relationship there, and that relationships between enslavers and the enslaved workers were not always one thing, was not always one dimensional, and could be very different. So Katherine Brown encountering emancipation is maybe a little bit different than, Susan, who was only living a few miles away. So one of the first records we have of Katherine Brown and emancipation is in January of 1863, and she's just writing about this buzz that she's hearing about the emancipation, about General Milroy in Winchester, who is he is banishing white families from Winchester, and he's absconding with this stuff, and his wife is stealing their china, and all this other stuff. But most crazily, he is also giving passage to enslaved workers to go retrieve their families from the countryside and then go to freedom in the North. So all of that is combined in this kind of otherworldly, can you believe it, entry in Katherine Brown's diary. And in the same week, only a couple days later, she writes this very quick entry. So all this great stuff is happening in Winchester. Also, the servants and children are now having a high time snowballing. They take sides and fight regular military battles with all the military terms. So in her mind, her domestic situation is the same. Her children and the servant, probably the servant children, are all playing together. Everything is as it should be, and Milroy is off his rocker, is kind of her take on it. Now, shortly after that, there is another account. The story that I'm mostly highlighting from Katherine Brown's diary here, and it's very short snippets, has to do with a man named Anthony who is enslaved with the family there. And in the springtime, on 2 occasions, Anthony helps to dissuade Union raiders from pillaging the family's food stores, right? So on one occasion, he plays dumb and doesn't know where something is hidden. And at another time, Union soldiers come in and demand that Anthony show them where the meat is, where we're going to take all your hams. And Anthony manages to convince them that there aren't any more, and that they should go on their way. So twice that we know of, Anthony kind of sticks his neck out for this family that he's been owned by, been a part of, whatever you'd want to say, for the last maybe his whole life. But that doesn't stop him on June 22nd of 1863. Again, you'll notice this date is very similar to our general's encounter in Aldie. So this is during the Battle of Middleburg, as these troops are making maneuvers all up and down Ashby's Gap Turnpike. And during this time on June 22nd, Sunnybank Farm is in Union picket lines. And again, this changes by the hour of whose lines they're behind at Sunnybank Farm. But at this particular instant on June 22nd, they're behind Union lines. And Anthony comes up on a horse, on a Yankee horse, with another Yankee with him. Anthony comes, he arrives at the house, he goes, to where he was staying, picks up all his clothes and leaves. And Katherine says that he looks guilty. But that's all she really says, is he looks guilty, he takes his things, and he goes. But that's not the last we hear of Anthony. The rest of the year passes. 1863 goes by. There's plenty more drama that happens in the Brown household. But then it is November 22nd, 1863, that she's writing about friends coming to visit. She's excited to see them. And then as kind of a postscript note, she writes, Anthony has come home again, is now in the yard looking scared instead of glad as he used to when they, Yankees, came about. He is entirely cured of them, is entirely changed, so humble and obedient. And we don't know more of the story about Anthony, this enslaved person who was at Sunnybank, who was gone for close to 6 months, you know, and I am so curious about what might have happened to him between those two time periods. But it's a really great example of the fact that freedom did not mean one thing for all of the individuals who were freed under the Emancipation Proclamation. It wasn't a universal, ta-da, now you can do whatever you want. There was still tremendous hardship into finding a place where you could, you know, find work or shelter or clothing or safety or whatever it might be. And so in the case of Warrenton, we saw one example of individuals being physically placed from where they were to a place where they could hypothetically find resources or do something. But then we also have people like Anthony who were literally caught in the waves of occupation, right? And we don't know if he, you know, did he ever meet someone who could give him opportunities? Was he caught up in more of the military struggles and really, you know, treated as a contraband worker by the Union Army? We don't know. But many of the individuals at Sunnybank stayed with the family through the war, and were paid wages afterwards, which happened with many households in the Piedmont. But I thought that was a really interesting peek. And if nothing else, we know that Anthony came back to the place where he had called home, you know, and hopefully more will be known about him pretty soon.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It reminds me of when we looked at 1862 and with someone like Noble Robinson going across the Potomac River and then going back and getting his family. But yeah, you're right. I mean, emancipation comes. It doesn't mean, hey, you're safe if you're an enslaved person, that you can then just say, wait, no. Didn't you see what Abraham Lincoln said? I'm free. Like anyone in the
What
South
does that
cares.
mean? Yeah,
And
exactly.
I was gonna say, when you go to a Union Army, potentially, you don't know who you're going to. There's a lot of racism in Northern armies. Like they're not accepting them with open arms necessarily either. And there's a lot of mistreatment and cruelty that they find amongst Northerners too, of course.
Yeah. One thing that I think is kind of a positive note. Sorry, that's a hiccup with the internet. One thing that I think is a positive note that I could end my story with is, and not necessarily having to do with 1863 itself, but I hadn't really put it together that there was already a 13th Amendment proposed before the Civil War broke out. So I think it was March of 1861, there was a 13th Amendment proposed that was that the United States, the federal government, would not interfere with any of the intrastate business that was being conducted, basically in really big parentheses, slavery. So that was almost the 13th Amendment, you know, and then the war broke out, states never ratified it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then it turns out that we got the 13th Amendment that did pass, and what a mind-boggling, you know, change that has made, and what a tremendous good for the country. So that's my moment that I could cheers.
Cheers that.
I was just going to add, you know, a really powerful and poignant reminder of all this, and probably one of my favorite historic sites in Alexandria. There's a Freedmen Cemetery that was recently, you know, within the last few decades uncovered, and there's a tremendous number of burials there, but the monument there, you know, has lists of all of the freed people and a tremendous amount of information on what life was actually like for these people once they got to a place like Alexandria, where there were schools and hospitals and things set up for them. But even then, you know, like you said, this idea of freedom is it's not a solid idea just because the president says it is. You know, there's a tremendous amount of unknown there, and these people, you know, face that as best they could, and that cemetery is an incredibly powerful reminder that, you know, just because these people were free does not mean life got, you know, like you know, many of them died in these freedmen villages, freedmen settlements, contraband camps. But then, you know, I think probably the most powerful part of it is, you know, there are places where on the rolls of freedmen living descendants have marked themselves. So, you know, although many of these people died, or many of them continued to live in terrible circumstances, they continued to exist, and they continued to struggle and make a new life for themselves within within freedom. And it's so powerful to see descendants of that community come back to this place and say, you know, this is where our family, you know, kind of began, you know, I guess in a sense, you know, where our free lives began. So if you're ever in Alexandria, go see the Freedmen Cemetery. It's a really, really cool site. I think a very well done reminder of what life was like for these people.
Yeah, and if you're traveling through Warrenton or Middleburg, both Katherine Brown's house, Sunnybank Farm, their shop in Middleburg, those buildings are still standing too. So their lives are not that far removed from ours. But I think it's time for a funny bar story.
Yeah, we need something
Hook us
funny.
up.
Lighten the mood, Lauren.
Yes. Well, I'm gonna lighten the mood, but then it's gonna get pretty intense.
Okay.
Yeah. But I do want to say, Anne-Marie, like quickly on what you just read. I really appreciate it, because one of the things that troubles me is if somebody picked that up and read it, it could lead to people going back to that lost cause narrative that, oh, the slaves didn't want to leave. Like, enslaved folk were happy. And that loyal slave narrative that comes out of the post-war period. And because white women's stories are recorded much more than people of color, we see that narrative and say, well, this is the primary source, right? Anthony was guilty, right? And I'm like, no, Katherine, Anthony was relieved, right?
Exactly. Like we don't know what Anthony felt. We only know what Katherine felt.
Exactly. And so I really appreciate you taking a source that is so privileged, right? And then dicing it apart to say, yeah, she said that, but Anthony had a story which we don't have, so we don't know. Because unfortunately, for so many decades and even until today, we see people pick up the sources of planters and Confederate elites and only look at them through that lens. And without interrogating it, it would be easy to say, oh, well, he came back, he missed slavery. Like, can we not? You know, so right. I think I just applaud your, source, because I'm one who tries to stay away from them, because I'm like, oh, I don't want people to get this message, but you did it, and I just thought it was really good. So thanks for, showing that perspective. Yeah, cheers again.
Cheers to the sources.
We can.
We can.
Okay,
yes, good. With the dark stuff, we'll cheers whatever we can.
Perfect. Okay, well, hopefully we'll find some reasons to cheers, because I have some good stuff to share. And I wanted to first tell kind of like a comical story and then lead into something more serious. But the first soldier I'm going to talk about, both are from 1863, or their stories are 1863. But the first story comes from an Illinois guy named John Miller. And John Miller, I don't know much about his background. I actually came across him in a court-martial case. And so we already know that John Miller is going to be in trouble, but the question is why and how. And so John Miller musters into the 14th Illinois Cavalry on January 7th, 1863. So right at the start of the year. And so he's stationed at Camp Peoria in Peoria, Illinois. And on February 28th, only about 6 weeks later, he is reported absent without leave. And nobody knows where he went, but he will be found. And they actually find John Miller. And John Miller is 3 hours, well, by car, 3 hours by car southwest of Peoria in St. Louis, Missouri. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this, because I live in St. Louis, Missouri. So it only happened about a mile from where I live right now. So the reason that they found him, and it was so easy to find him, is they found him selling liquors and tending bar in a house of prostitution.
Yes.
Yes. Not only was he selling liquors and tending bar, he had 3 women around him. And not only that, but he was easy to spot because he was wearing his uniform and emblems of his rank and position. And he was a 2nd lieutenant, so he had his sash, he had his insignia, and he was arrested and brought to a court-martial. So the court-martial, which happened in St. Louis in August, charged him with conduct unbecoming of an officer and a gentleman. And they brought a few witnesses. And the first witness said, the house of ill fame, which is at 232 2nd Street, which actually now is where the arch is. So the gateway, there is no more 2nd Street. 2nd Street is now the gateway arch. I know, so now it's the gateway arch. But the house of ill fame is a very low, contemptible place, probably the most miserable in St. Louis. Miller had been acting as a pimp for the house. So not only that, but another witness was asked, well, how did you know he was serving alcohol? And the witness replied, quote, when I see a man serving liquor, that's proof enough for me, end quote. So what happened is our boy John pled not guilty, and the court-martial found him guilty. So he was dismissed from service. He forfeited all payment that was still due to him by the U.S. government, and he was banned from any U.S. government service in the future. And not only did they do that, but they said that his story needs to be published in all public papers in both Peoria and St. Louis. So he's kicked out of the Army, forfeits all his pay, can't ever have a government position, and also will carry the stigma of public shaming.
Shame.
And yeah, so yes, just like Game of Thrones, right? Just like
pimping ain't easy. Pimping ain't easy.
Yes, pimping is not easy, and he got
that's our mission statement. Pimping ain't easy.
And so I think that, like, I share this case with my college students and they love it because it's about booze and sex and all the great things. But when we look down at this case, we see a man who enlisted. He volunteered. He did not, he was not drafted. He volunteered. And after 6 weeks of camp, whether it be the fear of battle, whether it be the regimen of drill and inspection, whatever it was, he said, this is not for me. And I'm not going to go home because I'm not going to deal with kind of that stigma. Instead, I'm going to take my talents to St. Louis and I'm going to party and I'm going to go big. And I'm a young adolescent man, and that's how I'm going to cope with it. And what's interesting is the regimental for the 14th Illinois Cavalry was published in 1898, and there is a mention of John Miller, but it said that he resigned. That's what they said about him.
And how?
Right. So instead of saying that he got fired, he quit on his own terms. So I like that. He resigned from.
Yeah, it was definitely on his own terms. And so he was a 2nd lieutenant. Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't 2nd lieutenant the highest rank that the general actually earned? Am I misremembering that?
Was it
Luigi?
Luigi?
Yeah, Luigi.
Oh no, Luigi was a colonel.
He was a colonel. Okay. Maybe I'm remembering in his Italian service. He got up too. Okay, so basically, if you become a 2nd lieutenant, you have one of 2 career options. You can go on to be the hero of Aldi, or you can become a pimp and a bartender. That's my understanding of military careers.
We'll have to ask our military friends about that.
Yeah.
And it puts you on a clear path to getting mentioned in history on tab 155 years later.
Right.
Yeah, win-win.
Yeah, so that story is interesting because I think a lot of times we forget that these are adolescent young men. They're put under intense pressures, and I'm guilty of this too, as being a Civil War historian. I'm always like, oh, they're ideological committed to these larger causes, but at the end of the day, they're young adolescent boys, and we see men deal with either the trauma or the perceived trauma as war in many different ways. And although Miller's might seem like an unconventional circumstance, We do see this quite often with court martials and with how soldiers react. And so, but I also, since this is a program where we are drinking and I am in St. Louis, I thought that would be like a little, story to tell before I lead into kind of my main story that I wanted to talk about. And it's a completely different experience from a man named Morris Brown Jr. And Morris Brown Jr. is also an adolescent young man. When the war starts, he is in college, actually. He is from the Finger Lakes region in New York, which our very own Joe Rizzo is quite close to. He's from Buffalo, so Joe's region.
It's all west of New York City at that point. They're all next.
Yeah. Yeah. So he is from the Finger Lakes region of New York, and he was attending Hamilton College when the war started in Clinton, New York. However, he was from a small town called Penn Yan, New York, and of Yates County. It was small, so there wasn't a regiment from the town. They kind of had to attach themselves to other local regiments. And so he couldn't find a regiment to join until the summer of 1862, kind of that second wave of volunteers after the Peninsula Campaign. And so he was able to enlist, and he mustered into the 126th New York Infantry Regiment on August 22nd, and he was only 21 years old. So when we think of getting mustered in, we figure men will have a few months to train, to drill, learn the routine. Well, in 3 weeks, Morris Brown Jr. will find himself at Harpers Ferry. And he and his unit are stationed on Bolivar Heights at the garrison that is supposed to protect Harpers Ferry at the confluence of the Shenandoah and Potomac rivers from Confederate attacks. And if we think about what's happening at Harpers Ferry or Maryland in mid-September 1862, we know that that is the heart and the beginnings of Lee's Maryland campaign. And so when they get there, simultaneously, Lee is going to divide his army and send Stonewall Jackson's men to Harpers Ferry. And so when Stonewall Jackson's men get there, not only are they going to, I guess you could say, win the battle at Harpers Ferry, but they will also capture 12,000 Union soldiers. So not only is it the single largest capture of Union troops during the war, but our Morris Brown Jr. and the 126th New York is part of that 12,000. And so they went into their first combat and they took a L, a big L, right? And so they come out as 0-1, right? So they had their chance. And not only did they not win, but they're going to develop the reputation as the cowards of Harpers Ferry.
Oh, come on.
I know. And
there's a lot of blame to go around at Harpers Ferry in 1862.
There is.
They don't deserve that.
Not the 126th.
Right? Like, we could go back to Special Orders 191 and we could look at all the ways that McClellan dropped the ball to protect these men, right? So I agree.
Yeah, hot take, it's all on Franklin. He should have kept pushing and
yes.
Harpers Ferry.
Yes, so there was a lot of blame to go around. And of course, these men get it. So what's going to happen is while our boy John Miller is he is about to enlist, we're going to see Morris Brown Jr. and his men. They're paroled the next day. And they're actually going to go to Camp Douglas in Chicago and work prison duty. And so now both of our boys are in Illinois. And so at the beginning of 1863, when we have John Miller enlist, our Morris Brown Jr. and his unit are going to go back east into DC. They are going to be stationed for the defense of DC, actually on Arlington Heights. So that's where they're going to open up their year 1863. Obviously, they have the stigma of being the cowards of Harpers Ferry, and a lot of these guys are ready for another chance to prove their worth. And they are going to meet their new divisional commander. And their new divisional commander is Brigadier General Alexander Fighting Ellick Hayes. And so General Hayes just well, he was wounded at 2nd Manassas and recovered from his wound, and he needs a job. So he is now in charge of this division to kind of get these guys, their spirits up, train them, teach them, and get them ready to fight another day. And that chance comes. And guess what day they get the order to join the Army of the Potomac? June 25th, 1863. So we know what's coming in a week. And so these guys, right? So I like sports. And so I always relate things to sports when I teach because it helps kind of make a metaphor. So this would be like getting called out of the bullpen in game 7, bottom of the 9th. You have an 0-1 record, and they're like, it's your turn, right? And so not only are these guys going to have to leave DC and go northwest to meet up at Gettysburg, but they are going to be not positioned, they're going to be assigned to join the 2nd Corps. So Hancock's Corps. And as we know, the 2nd Corps will be the Union Army that is responsible for stopping Lee's assault on Cemetery Ridge on July 3rd. So like I said, they're going in to, this pinnacle of the battle, this pinnacle turning point of the war, and this is their next chance. And so many people might say these guys are probably scared, but what Morris Brown does is he actually says, this is my chance. And
Bring it on.
Yes, he's like, it's go time. And so
total redemption right here.
It's redemption. And that's why I love it, because as somebody who's captured and wants to prove their worth, they've had, from September to July, like almost a whole year to think about this chance. And so I have a little map that I made that I'm going to share with you all, that kind of shows.
Imagining, just while you pull this up, I'm imagining like a Rocky style montage, right, of these guys getting geared up for the battle, and like,
I know, right, like Queen playing in the
yeah,
background.
exactly, some Survivor, yeah.
So I made this little map because Hancock's 2nd Corps, we usually associate with fighting Pickett's division. But when you look at this map, what's interesting is the Union line runs north to south, right? However, the Emmitsburg Road is going to, that does not run north to south, right? Because these roads come into Gettysburg like spokes of a wheel. So the Emmitsburg Road actually meets up with the Union line, and you can see that they intersect, and that's exactly where the 126th New York is positioned. So that's the place that they have to hold. So aside from our 8th Ohio, which is their brigade friends, they are at the extreme right flank of the Union Army, and they're tasked with kind of making sure that the assault does not get on their right side, does not cross over their right shoulder. And so you can see that they will not be fighting Pickett's men. Pickett's men are down here. Okay, so Joe, here's time. Joe likes the 8th Virginia and studies them. And so they're getting torn up. They're retreating. Okay, so Joe and I figured this out yesterday. We're like, did they fight against one another? But so Joe's boys are down here, and my guys are up here, Morris Brown. And so what Morris Brown does is he is actually a captain, and he is in charge of Company A. He always wanted to promote it. He's a go-getter. He wants to be a leader. And so this is his time to shine. And so what Morris Brown does is he's given an order to take his company. Now this company is only 18 men. Okay, so it's, a very small company. So he and his 18 men are tasked, as you see, Lane's brigade is breaking up. Okay, and as they see a gap in Lane's brigade, they say for the 126th New York, go a quarter of a mile in front of our line with your 18 guys and capitalize on that break in their line, right? Now, a lot of us would be like, no. If you learned anything from Daniel Sickles yesterday, you don't create a salient because you got to stay in a line. If you make a gap, you could be surrounded, you could be captured, that gap could be exploited by the enemy, it's game over, right? Well, what Morris Brown Jr. does is he takes his men Okay, so these 18 guys go out to attack Lane's men, and some of them are retreating, some of them advancing. It's chaotic. Lane's men are retreating and advancing. These guys are all heading forward, and the guys in the 126, the other companies are like, we don't know where he went, because it's smoky, it's chaotic. And then all of a sudden, not too long later, a few minutes later, I shouldn't say a few minutes, maybe like half an hour later, they all of a sudden see Morris Brown Jr. coming towards them with 50 Confederate prisoners. So 50 men they captured, and the flag, the Confederate flag of those troops. So he got a flag, he got 50 Confederates, and cheers to that.
Cheers to Morris Brown.
Yes. And so he went in game 7 and he struck out the side. And so it was so great, because not only did he do that, but for those of you who might not be familiar with the Civil War, the biggest thing you can do at this time is capture a flag. What flag bearers, if you've seen any reenactments, flag bearers go into the skirmish or the engagement with no weapon in the front, and their sole duty is to carry that flag, and it's an honor, right? Today we would think, oh, the John Millers of the world can carry the flag because they don't need a weapon, but actually it was a huge honor. And so it was the center and kind of the glue that held the regiment together. So by taking that flag, you're taking the heart of the regiment. Now, 2 things. Hayes reportedly took a captured Confederate flag, and he had several in his division that were captured up and down the line. But one of the flags he took, not sure if it was Morris Brown's or not, he took the Confederate flag, got on his horse, and rode up and down his division's line, dragging the Confederate flag in the dirt. So I think Hayes's celebration does show a lot of, I made these men, I got them ready, and they prevailed. They had their moment and they had their redemption. And not only that, but the other part is the flag that they captured was the 28th North Carolinians. And the 28th North Carolinians are part of A.P. Hill's Corps. Now, A.P. Hill's Corps, A.P. Hill inherited it from Stonewall Jackson. So the 28th North Carolina was at Harpers Ferry. So the 28th North Carolina, they captured Morris Brown's unit, and now Morris Brown's unit captured them and captured their flag. Boom.
Boom.
Yes. And so for his maneuver and for his heroic actions at Gettysburg, Morris Brown Jr. was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor in 1869 for that. And so, and there was only one other Congressional Medal of Honor winner from the 126 New York, and it was also someone else who captured a flag on that day. So that's kind of Morris Brown's, the pinnacle of his military career. Now in the fall, oh, cheers, we're cheersing again for the medal.
Morris Brown, yeah.
Medal. So that fall, Morris Brown is, like most of the Union Army of the Potomac that does not go to Chattanooga, he is stationed on the Rappahannock and the Rapidan River. And while they're kind of juggling, should we fight at the Mine Run campaign or just build trenches? What do we do? He is on picket duty, like most soldiers, and he is sitting across from Confederate lines within proximity. And one morning he is eating breakfast on picket duty, and Morris Brown Jr. hears a Confederate talking, and the Confederate says, "Hey, Yank, what do you have to eat?" And Morris Brown says, "Well, you can come share it with me as long as you drop your gun." And he was like, "Well, I'll come share it with you, but will you let me go?" And he said, "Yeah, I will let you go after we're done." And so the Confederate came over. The Confederate and him shared breakfast. They talked about the war. They exchanged newspapers. And then he skedaddled back over to his Confederate line. And so that fraternization that Morris Brown does is kind of the heart of like what I study, but there's a stigma that soldiers who fraternized were cowards or shirkers or bad soldiers. And I'm like, well, he just he just was awarded a Medal of Honor 2 months ago, and he's doing this. So what Morris Brown Jr. is able to do is tell the difference between and compartmentalize when there's an enemy on the battlefield versus an enemy in this space that more resembles camp life with my own comrades than a battle where we're taught to wound, shot, and win. And so he's able to compartmentalize this, and his fraternization story is actually like what I lead my book off with in my introduction.
Hey, Laura, you want to take it off share screen? Because everyone's just looking at the map.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, to you until, okay, cool.
Here's our faces again. And so cheers to our faces.
Yeah.
And so to finish off Morris Brown Jr.'s story and his trajectory throughout 1863 is 1863 was his year for sure. And unfortunately, I wish I had a happy ending for 1864 or the rest of the war for Morris Brown. He stays with the Second Corps. His unit still stays with Hancock as the Overland Campaign begins. He fights at Wilderness, survives. He fights at Spotsylvania, survives. He fights at Cold Harbor and survives. And he crosses the James. So he will follow this with the Second Corps, cross the James River and begin the assault on Petersburg. And on June 22nd, 1864, during the Union assault on the Jerusalem Plank Road, Morris Brown Jr. was the highest ranking person in his unit. And so he is leading the 126th New York in the trenches, and he is shot in the head. He's shot in the head and dies instantly. So he will not survive the war, and his Congressional Medal of Honor will be awarded posthumously in 1869. And it's so sad and it's so tragic, but I think his story helps remind us that just because somebody survived Antietam or just because somebody survived Gettysburg does not mean they survived the war. And in Morris Brown Jr.'s case, like one of the things we always think of is like, oh, he had this moment at Gettysburg. Now he's going to have, you know, this ability, almost like this invincibility to get through the war. And he died of a combat wound. But imagine men who survived Gettysburg and then died of dysentery, right? Like how awful that is, that these men will survive some of the hottest spots and then perish in the last few years, or, you know, the last months of the war. And so Morris Brown Jr., his year was 1863. We talk about it. There's an excellent his letters are edited by Wayne Mayhood. But unfortunately, we never got to see what happened to him throughout the rest of the war, his life. So I think both Miller and Morris Brown Jr., it's good to see their stories because they're much more nuanced than good soldier, bad soldier, right? Court-martial, Medal of Honor, was a hero, survived the war. There's so many different experiences, and by looking at them through a lens and through the year of 1863, I think we get to see that the soldier experience is messy, just like life and just like history. And it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And so I think both of their stories kind of fill in the gaps of what we see as the common Civil War soldier. Cheers.
I think that's amazing.
Thank you. I'm sweating. I was getting all into it.
And like I was kind of struck between the parallels of our stories, and for the benefit of the audience, we did not dissect, you know, of course, what each of us were going to say beforehand, but just the idea that there is no one story. There is no one, this person was a soldier, or this person was enslaved, or this person, you know, was trying to run a farm. There's no one story. There's so much out there. There's so much triumph and heartbreak, and some of it happens in the same person, you know? Yeah, it's crazy.
Man, if we could ever get together in the same place again, we can go to General Pickett's Buffet, which is right across the street from where the 126 was, and we can celebrate them.
Yeah.
Let's set an appointment.
Right now. Yeah, that's going to happen.
Yeah, I was going to say what a great story, but I guess he dies, so it's not that.
I know. That's why it's a good point.
Yeah, and understand, like, in these privates too, like you're talking about thousands of people. So, you know, an unfortunate thing, like, I mean, you see that too with other soldiers at Gettysburg, whether it be, you know, with the Howard soldiers at Chancellorsville, the German soldiers, you know, who just get dumped on for the, you know, exposed to the flying attack. I mean, these aren't individual soldiers determining it one way or the other. And a lot of times they get, you know, there's I don't want to say Luigi doesn't deserve all praise, but there's unfair praise, but then there's also really unfair criticism.
Way to drag the general.
I mean, it's all about self-promotion, dude. You got to sell that story.
Yeah, bud.
Yeah, and that's what wins.
Yeah, in the 28th North Carolina, they are in the same brigade as the 18th North Carolina, the guys who shot Jackson. So there, we know that Virginians looked down on North Carolinians after the war. And so we know that there's a lot of like, well, if North Carolina just didn't suck, like we would have won, you know. And so Joe, a lot of what you're saying is embedded with state rivalries and local rivalries, and also why John Miller's regiment like didn't want to talk about like his fault, because they're like, no, we're the best. And it does show that memory of the soldiers did have a lot of control over the memory. And I know that we always chalk it up to like lost causers and politicians, which is true, but soldiers want their men and their service to be etched with them coming out as the best they can. And so
honorable, victorious, you know, at the very least, not a bunch of pimps, you know, living it up in St. Louis.
Oh, shit.
Well, from pimps to unionists and society.
That's a history on tap first.
Am I the first?
Cheers.
Okay.
I mean, I've come close a few times, but.
All right,
Sorry,
Joe.
Sorry, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, there's winners and losers, and some guys who get known for really weird things, and other ones who are just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yeah. And we talked about, especially in 1862, how there is already a movement toward a harder war, and civilians feel war a lot of ways that soldiers do too. And in Loudoun, we already know that there's, you know, strong unionist sentiment, there's strong secessionist sentiment. And when you think prisons, though, like Luigi down at Libby Prison, so I think mentioned Camp Douglas in Illinois, there's Elmira in New York, of course, Andersonville in Georgia. You think those, and you think soldiers are the ones who are sent there. The story I want to tell shows that political prisoners are swept up in this game of war too. And I want to start in the spring of 1863. It's a story that's very complicated and goes months. But in the spring of 1863, a Virginian named Samuel Means is fighting for the Union Army in the Loudoun Rangers, a group partially comprised of Loudoun soldiers for the Union. And Samuel Means takes some political prisoners. When he's passing through Loudoun, he stops at the house of someone named Henry Ball. Goes to their home. He arrests Henry Ball for a few things, but there's three reasons why he gets arrested. He's charged with destruction of wheat, so it couldn't get in the hands of Union soldiers, guiding enemy troops to Union camps. He had long thought he was the one who had led Elijah White to some soldiers near Waterford. And then also conduct contrary to, quote, the rules of civilized warfare. I don't know what that means.
The pre-Geneva Convention?
Yeah. So they arrest Henry Ball basically for being a secessionist, and a very well-known secessionist throughout the northern Loudoun community. They also seize some of his horses because they need horses. But they don't stop there.
You broke the rules and you have horses.
Yeah, win-win for Means. Well, he actually wants win-win-win. He actually takes someone else. He also detains someone named Albert Campbell Belt, who's also a very known secessionist in northern Loudoun, and charges him with being a Confederate soldier. He was part of the Loudoun Cavalry, actually. So he detains these two well-known secessionist civilians in northern Loudoun, takes them back across the Potomac River. Eventually, these two men, and just for the story's sake, I'll call them the secessionists, they get sent ultimately to Fort Delaware, a prison in the Fort Delaware River. Yeah, Travis's face shows that's not a place you want to get sent. There's civilian prisoners there, but there's also soldiers sent there too, and really just criminals as well. So those two get sent, and their families, of course, want to try to get them back. So they're writing letters to the Confederate government, to the United States government. They go to Fort Delaware to try to plead their case to let them go on humanitarian grounds. But they fail in doing so. So the Confederacy is looking for ways to get these two citizens, secessionist citizens, back. The Gettysburg Campaign disrupts it. So, it goes through the summer, but then after the Gettysburg campaign, at the end of the summer, they once again try to figure out a way to get them back. And Jeb Stuart, and I'll show a picture of Samuel Means if anyone's curious who this is.
He does have a nice beard.
He does.
So,
Yeah, there we go.
Talk Samuel Means. That is him again, a Virginian fighting for the Union Army. He's got connections with his family, of course, still in Virginia. But he is the one who then arrests both Albert Bond and Henry Ball and Alfred Bell.
Right.
Those two secessionists. So Jeb Stuart sends a message to a person born in Maryland, but fighting for the Confederacy. Again, to add to the confusion, well known to this area, Elijah White. And I'll pull a picture of Elijah White.
White's kind of a weird looking dude.
Does not have good beard
Back to the
game.
beard.
Mm.
So Elijah White, well known, again, his family, he relocates them in the 1850s just north of downtown Leesburg. He's tasked with taking some prisoners as well, basically as hostages. And the person he's told to take is Asa Bond. And Bond is the father-in-law to Samuel Means. Again, that guy who started us all by taking Henry Ball prisoner in the spring of 1863.
Getting personal.
Yeah, so it says, take Asa Bond, a known Unionist, of course. And White's like, okay, well, let's take someone else, though, in addition to that, so we can basically do a 2-for-2 swap.
Yeah.
So that's the plan. So White sends troops in the fall of 1863 to go get Bond. The other person they determine they want to take is a man named William Williams. His parents clearly aren't the most creative when it comes to naming children, but it's easy for me to remember at least. So first they go to William Williams' house. They go on a Sunday evening. William and his wife are entertaining guests. They knock on the door, so at least they're polite that way. They knock on his door. He answers, and a pistol is then right in his face. And he's told he's being taken prisoner. He's taken, his wife at least throws a coat on him as they're taking him away.
Oh, God.
He then gets taken away by White's troops. Then they want, again, the target, primary one is Asa Bond. So the word's already getting out that there's Confederate soldiers doing these things here. So they try to go to Bond's house. When they go there, they knock on the door. It's not Bond that answers. It's actually two young women who answer the door. They know what's up, and they basically dare the Confederates to try something at the door. And this actually becomes well known throughout Northern Loudoun about this kind of interaction between these two women and the Confederate soldiers. And it's actually a secessionist woman who writes about it, basically in the town gossip about what happened. And what she wrote about this interaction at the door was Mrs. Means and Miss Bond stood in their door and dared the Southerners to enter. They did enter, slapped Mrs. Means' jaw, and Miss Bond fired a revolver on them. 'Tis a wonder they took it from her. If we had dared to do that with a Yank, we would have been shot instantly. So they basically stand around.
Can I just point to, I love how she refers to them as like Southerners when like these women are also Southerners. They're Virginians. Like this is
Rachel
Southern on
Means-
Southern crime right now.
Exactly.
Rachel Means is a grade A badass.
She's-
Like
Yeah.
that's awesome.
And we've got a good comment from those watching that Steve Buscemi would make a great Elijah White.
Wow.
Yeah.
I can
Good ball
see
rolling.
it. I can
I see
see
it.
it.
So while the women are basically distracting them and basically standing their ground at the door, Asa Bond sneaks out the back and he avoids being captured. And now this is a total screw up. This is the guy that they primarily wanted to get. And they at least need to get two people. So they got William Williams. They screw up on getting Bond. So like, well, we got to grab someone. So they go to a nearby Quaker schoolmaster, Robert Hillingsworth, and they just take him because they need a second body, basically. So these two Unionists, I'll call them the Unionists, get then taken down to Mount Gilead, meet with Elijah White. Elijah White says, I'm not going to release you, like you're hostages. But what he does agree to is to parole the two Unionists for 3 weeks. He says, I'm going to parole you, go back to the Waterford area, convince the United States to let go of the two secessionists at Fort Delaware, and then you can be free. So again, the families are trying in vain in various ways to try to get the two secessionists released. They failed to do so. Those 3 weeks go pretty quickly. And it's actually the Union Army then which plots a way to keep them from being taken hostage again. So the Loudoun Rangers actually plot a mock arrest where they would come across the Potomac, they would arrest Hollingsworth and Williams and take them into Maryland as a mock arrest to prevent them from going back into Confederate hands.
Okay.
That seems too complicated. Like,
Okay.
why bother?
Well, it gets especially complicated when the two guys who like are hostages for no reason are like, no, we took an oath, we gotta go back. So they're like, no, so they go back voluntarily, go back to the Mount Gilead area, meet with Elijah White, and then he says, I'm gonna treat you the way that the secessionists are being treated. So they are sent to Castle Thunder in Richmond, Virginia. Another notorious prison, especially for spies, traitors, and political prisoners. Particularly ruthless was the captain who was in control of Castle Thunder. So then that's where they get sent. And now it's a standoff. There's more people temporarily taken hostage as it amplifies, but that's really what the civilians are trying to avoid. So the families, again, one strong unionist, others that are strong secessionists, I mean, they have a common goal here. They want to get their family members home. So they're working together to figure out the best way to do so. So Mary Williams, the wife of the unionist, she goes to Washington, D.C. She tries to get really an audience with Lincoln to get them released. She brings petitions by loyal Loudoun residents, basically to call for these two secessionists to be released to get the unionists out. Lincoln's got a soft heart. He's been known to do this once in a while in the war. He writes a note, an unofficial note, but a note to the Commissioner of Prisoner Exchanges. What that note says is, will General Hitchcock please see these friends and effect the special exchange they request if he consistently can? Ethan Hitchcock sees that. It's Lincoln's handwriting. Sure, he'll let him go. Seems like this solves the problem. Well, of course, the drama continues. Secretary of War Stanton steps in and says, no, I'm countermanding this order. We can't reward hostage situations because that would just lead the Confederacy doing it more often. So Stanton says, no dice. So Mary Williams has to go back to Waterford, very sad. She doesn't come back with her husband. Comes back and finds out her husband's not only still in Castle Thunder, but also has smallpox. So she doesn't even know if he'll survive that. So again, as time goes on, the families are trying to figure out, what do we do here? We've pleaded to both governments and no one's budging on this situation. Ultimately, what happens that finds some success is that Henry Ball, one of those secessionists in prison in Fort Delaware, he writes a letter to the Confederate government from prison. And what he says in that letter is, I don't want people taken essentially hostage on my account for being in prison, nor should Virginians also be taking other Virginians captive. And it does have an effect, and the Secretary of War for the Confederacy agrees to release Williams and Hollingsworth. They then can just get a travel permit, and then they can move from Richmond, go back home. Well, to get a travel permit, of course, you've got to take an oath, but now an oath to the Confederacy.
What?
Add to the story,
Uh-oh.
they don't want to take the oath of allegiance to the Confederacy. So this saga continues. Luckily, they do have a friend in the War Department for the Confederacy who gets them a travel permit without getting involved with taking an oath. So then the two Unionists travel by rail to Stanton, Virginia, and then it's basically on their own from that point. They're coming up from Stanton. They get arrested again by Confederate soldiers. Luckily, it's brief, and they do finally make it back, and the two men arrive back in Waterford on Christmas Day, 1863.
Oh, Merry Christmas.
Talk about a Hallmark Christmas movie waiting to be
Yeah,
made.
right?
That's very Hallmark.
I would watch that Hallmark movie. A very secessionist Christmas.
And so speaking of secessionists, for them, they're still in Fort Delaware. So when word gets out to the federal government that Williams and Hollingsworth are let go out of Castle Thunder, finally Secretary of War Stanton does relent, and he releases Ball and Belt. And they arrive just a couple days after Christmas, 1863, and they are then back as well. Both the Unionists and secessionists are back with their family in northern Loudoun. A confusing story, a dramatic one that goes months when it really didn't have to, unnecessarily complicated, but shows a very important point that civilians are getting very much wrapped up in war, and it's not armies in the fields, and civilians can be in trouble because of political opinions. They can be in trouble because of actions, or they could just be in the wrong place at the wrong time.
And I think it's another great example that Loudon is like in both territories. So you can be nabbed by either Union or Confederate soldiers at any time, even though you are a native of Virginia, you know, and gosh darn that Virginia honor where you won't take vows you don't believe in and stuff like that.
Yeah, these guys in their oaths.
It's exactly like what you said earlier about like it being a beach where waves wash over, and it just depends on which wave happens to be coming your way.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happens in northern Loudoun and really northern Virginia, being so close to the Potomac. And it's just fascinating that you've got a Virginian Samuel Means, who's the one that captures the secessionists, and a born Marylander in Elijah White, who then, of course, is the one who's tasked with taking 2 Union hostages.
Yeah, I love it. I feel like a different, you know, subtitle for this could have been 1863. It's complicated.
Yeah.
Oh man, yeah, the stories went a little long, but yeah, these I think fascinating how they all some ways intersect too. Began to show that this is a very messy story. In 1863, it's just getting messier, where it's not the good old days of George McClellan, who sees enslaved people as Confederate property and that the wars are limited. I mean, civilians are getting involved here, and again, it can be the wrong place at the wrong time, or it can be people who are then suffering for outspoken beliefs.
And every level of society. You know, it's no longer a war of army versus army. It's everybody's got a stake in it to some degree, you know, and that's pretty amazing. Do we have any questions that are coming in?
Yeah, I know we're about out of time. Andrea, let us know if we got any more coming through or any more suggestions for casting our Hallmark movie.
Yes.
We'll have to start plotting.
Yeah, I feel like we need an overworked single woman who falls in love with one of these individuals, because that's how Hallmark works.
Yeah.
Right. He's got to return back to his hometown after being gone for like 20 years and being a big city hotshot. He gets back to Waterford, Virginia, and meets the Quaker girl of his dreams or whatever.
Wow, it writes itself, really.
I know, it really
Before
does.
getting back home, he's got to chop down the perfect Christmas tree.
I mean, if this guy just happens to be an Italian nobleman fighting for the Union Army, then with a glorious mustache.
Well, I don't think we've necessarily got more just comments, no specific questions coming in. I know we are about out of time. Any parting shots from any of the stories we told?
I mean, again, huge fan of Rachel Means, who, you know, it's up to debate how much of an effect she actually has on Samuel Means and his Union support. You know, she, of course, is the Quaker. It's her family, the Bonds, that are the Quakers, not Means himself. So curious about what Sam's actual thoughts on, you know, abolition and the Union, etc. are. Regardless, though, she was a force to be reckoned with. And if there's anything I love, it's a woman who is a force to be reckoned with.
All right, well, cheers to that.
Yeah. Going to what Lauren said about veterans writing their stories, Sam Means of the Loudon Rangers is a perfect example of that. Briscoe Goodhart of the Loudon Rangers writes the regimental history, and as much as I enjoy the Loudon Rangers, he really oversells their record a little bit.
They saved the
makes
Union
them a little more formidable than they probably actually were, but you know.
I think most Southern forces and probably some Northern forces who interacted with the Loudon Rangers were much more familiar with the backs of them, you know, than any other part of the group.
Yeah.
Oh,
as someone that studies Cole's Maryland Cavalry, you kind of get the impression that the Marylanders thought the Loudon Rangers were kind of like the helpless younger brothers. They're like, oh, we got to go bail them out again. We got to go like save these guys' butts again.
The scrappy doos of that relationship. And to use a very Southern term, bless their hearts.
Bless their hearts.
The Loudon Rangers.
So Lauren, you've got a book coming out, right? Later this year?
Yes,
Tell us
sir.
about that.
Do you want to give that a plug? We always give plugs right now.
Yeah, I'll give it a plug. It's coming out August 1st, and it is about when I told the story about Morris Brown Jr. fraternizing with the Confederate on the Rapidan in October 1863. There is lots of that throughout the war, and my chapters on soldier fraternization cover when they trade commodities like coffee and tobacco, when they exchange newspapers for information, when they negotiate ceasefires to stop relentless picket fire. And then I also do trace the memory of fraternization and how it's kind of used as a tool by reconciliationists to kind of say, oh, look, we got along during the war, so let's get along now and just forget about everything that ever happened. So it's called Friendly Enemies, Soldier Fraternization Throughout the American Civil War. And it is with the University of Nebraska Press. And I think it is a great balance of battlefield history and soldiers' experiences mixed with some social, academic, historical analysis. So it was kind of born, the idea was born when I worked at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. So it is, if you're a military buff, this is for you. And if you're an academic historian, this is for you. And if you want a Christmas present, this is for your mom and your aunt and your Joe.
And if you want more information on the book, we did an interview with Lauren for the Loudoun Museum. It's on the Loudoun Museum Facebook page. We did about a month ago. We get more into details of some of the stuff on the book.
That's really cool. I'm actually from Fredericksburg, so I'm like, and I worked there for a while after college. I'm curious if, I'm sure we know a lot of the same people in common. That's really, I'll have to look up that book. That sounds really cool.
Yeah, sounds
and
great.
Also, did you think about calling it Frenemies?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
I wondered.
Oh,
It
yes.
was laying that way.
Yeah, Frenemies has gotten a lot of advice or a lot of support. So that's kind of one of my working titles. The other one is Boys Will Be Boys, because it's kind of just like, yeah, of course they would do this. You know, banter and jocular fun before a game.
Yeah.
But I would love to, Joe and I talked about it. Hopefully when things get better, I'm going to come to Virginia and I would love to talk at Loudoun. And then if you guys, I don't know how far apart you are exactly, but we could co-sponsor it, or I could
come up with some kind of either partnership thing or have you out too. It'd be fun to even just drink with you privately instead of on the internet.
And
Yes.
Lauren, we do have a question. Maybe like after this, you can go on to the comment section. Mike Ferroni just asked about some of the sources that you use. So if you could just jump on that and respond to him on Facebook, that'd be awesome.
Of course, yes. Oh, I can cite these. I have the court-martial records and the books.
He's gonna regret asking that question.
Civil War court-martial records are my favorite things in the whole world. Like, I want a Law and Order series that's just Civil War court-martials. Like, yes, that's what I want.
So what do you guys got going on at Mosby this week? What's tomorrow for Live at 5?
Ooh, tomorrow we have a live at 5. We're going to be talking with Bobby Jacobs, who's a longtime Fauquier County educator, both at the high school level and at the university level. He will be giving an overview of Fauquier County history, and we'll also be talking about some of the preservation efforts that are going on to protect that. And then on Sunday, we'll be talking a little bit of Loudoun County agricultural history with Lori Kimball, the director of the Loudoun Heritage Farm Museum.
Awesome. Great. And Lauren, there's we got one more question in too, just about like a link to pre-order from Civil War Trails. So if you could just throw that in too. And what I'll do tomorrow on the Loudoun Museum Facebook page, I'll repost the interview we did last month too, in case people want to hear a little more about it.
Yeah, thanks, Civil War Trails. I can just post it right on Facebook, right, Joe?
Yep, you can do whatever you want.
Thanks, Drew.
Thanks, Drew. And thanks, Lauren, for being on the call. This was so much fun.
Lauren. That was great.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm sorry that I now hold the title of being the first person to curse on History on Tap. So
that I can think of. I might have let something slip at some point. I don't know, but
we'll get a certificate made or something and we'll send it to you.
We'll send it to you. You can frame it.
Oh yeah, it'll be like my PhD and then that, like together.
Andrea, get working on Canva to make that certificate tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll go ahead and do a final toast maybe for a send off. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and come back again for next week for more History on Tap.
Ooh, what's next week's topic?
Founding falsehoods.
Founding falsehoods. We're in my territory now.
We're going way back, 18th century.
Awesome. Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Bye.